Welcome to Devotionary, where we make the Bible accessible and applicable. Everybody has a weakness, at least one, and David was no exception. His personal point of weakness was his love for women. In fact, we might say he had an obsession for women. And Satan was going to have a field day using David's obsessive preoccupation with the opposite sex to undermine his commitment to God. It's not that there was anything wrong with David, a red-blooded Hebrew male, from being attracted to women. It's that he couldn't seem to control his attraction. He had a lust problem, and he used women to satisfy his own desires. But not just physically. Women stroked David's ego. They provided him with satisfaction and a feeling of significance. His conquest of them provided him with a sense of power and control. But they became a huge distraction in his life, keeping him from fully placing his hope and trust in God. And in 1 Samuel chapter 25, verses 39 through 44, we're going to see David driven by his desire for Abigail and distracted from his God-given mission to become the next king of Israel. In these closing verses of chapter 25, we're given a glimpse into an area of David's life that was going to prove an ongoing problem for him throughout his life. He loved women. And this attraction to the opposite sex would be a constant thorn in his side, even after becoming king. He would even pass on this propensity to his son Solomon, who took David's obsession with women to a whole new level. Now, King Solomon loved many foreign women. Besides Pharaoh's daughter, he married women from Moab, Ammon, Edom, Sidon, and from among the Hittites. The Lord had clearly instructed the people of Israel, "You must not marry them because they will turn your hearts to their gods." Yet Solomon insisted on loving them anyway. He had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines. And in fact, they did turn his heart away from the Lord. 1 Kings 11, verses 1 through 3. And all of this, as the passage reflects, was in direct violation of God's commands. The king must not take many wives for himself, because they will turn his heart away from the Lord. Deuteronomy 17, verse 17. Yet after David finally became king, he would continue his practice of accumulating wives, in direct violation of God's command. After moving from Hebron to Jerusalem, David married more concubines and wives, and they had more sons and daughters. 2 Samuel 5, verse 13. David was a man after God's own heart, but he was far from perfect. Women were his Achilles' heel, and he found Abigail highly attractive. On top of that, she was godly, wise, assertive, brave, insightful, and a take-charge kind of woman. And it didn't hurt that she was recently widowed. In fact, David didn't seem to give Nabal's body time to cool off before he made the move on Abigail, asking her to marry him. The text ends with a statement. David also took Ahinoam of Jezreel, and both of them became his wives. 1 Samuel 25, verse 43. It also references Michal, David's first wife, whom he had to leave behind when he fled from Saul. She was eventually given to another man, but David most likely didn't know that at the time. So effectively, he now had 3 wives, again in direct disobedience to the will of God. Why is this important? It provides us with an insight into the life of this man who would prove to be Israel's greatest king, and who, as has already been pointed out, was declared by God to be a man after his own heart. David loved God. He wanted to serve God. He had a deep desire to honor and obey God. But he also had a sin nature, just like the rest of us. And one of David's weak spots would be his attraction to women. Satan would repeatedly use this weakness to his own advantage, tempting David to give in to his overactive libido. David would learn to justify his actions, excusing his sexual obsession as natural and normal. And yet this sinful proclivity was a spiritual weakness, a chink in his armor that would make him an easy target for the enemy. There are some less than flattering similarities between David and the Old Testament judge, Samson, when it comes to this issue. During a time when the Jews were being tormented by the Philistines because of their disobedience, God raised up Samson to be their judge and deliverer. He was a powerful man, but he had a particular weakness. One day when Samson was in Timnah, one of the Philistine women caught his eye. When he returned home, he told his father and mother, "A young Philistine woman in Timnah caught my eye. I want to marry her. Get her for me." Judges 14, verses 1 through 2. Like David, Samson couldn't keep his eyes or his hands off of women. His mother and father tried to reason with Samson and talk him out of choosing a wife who was a pagan, but he wouldn't listen. "Get her for me. She looks good to me." Judges 14, verse 3. Later on we read, one day Samson went to the Philistine town of Gaza and spent the night with a prostitute. Judges 16, verse 1. And then, sometime later, Samson fell in love with a woman named Delilah, who lived in the valley of Sorek. Judges 16, verse 4. Each of these women would prove to be a thorn in Samson's side. They would cause him much grief and sorrow, and his dalliance with Delilah would result in his own death. David, too, would struggle with a lustful, almost lascivious attraction to women. The most infamous story concerning David and his love affair with the opposite sex involves his affair with Bathsheba. David was the king. He was rich, powerful, and happily married to several women already. But one day, as he walked in the rooftop patio of his palace, he spied Bathsheba bathing al fresco. David was in the wrong place at the wrong time. The passage tells us in the spring of the year, when kings normally go out to war, David sent Joab and the Israelite army to fight the Ammonites. However, David stayed behind in Jerusalem. 2 Samuel 11, verse 1. David wasn't where he was supposed to be. He was the warrior king, but instead of doing battle with the Ammonites, David would end up battling his own lusts and losing. His lust for Bathsheba quickly turned to action, and he had sex with her. When their affair resulted in her pregnancy, he began a cover-up campaign that eventually led him to have her husband, a faithful soldier in his army, purposely exposed and killed on the front lines of battle. Also, David could marry his wife and cover up his illicit affair. James provides us with a stark explanation of how this whole process works. Temptation comes from our own desires, which entice us and drag us away. These desires give birth to sinful actions, and when sin is allowed to grow, it gives birth to death. James 1, verses 14 through 15. David was a man after God's own heart, but he had a problem. His heart was divided. He loved women. He saw them as a source of satisfaction, comfort, pleasure, and self-worth. They made him feel good. They provided him with companionship. Perhaps they helped fulfill his need for conquest. Whatever drove his love affair with women, it would end up distracting him from what should have been his primary focus, his love for and dedication to God. The chapter ends with the statement, Saul had given Michal his daughter, David's wife, to Palti, the son of Laish, who is of Galem. 1 Samuel 25, verse 44. This is important because while it might be easy to use this as an explanation why David took Abigail to be his wife, it falls short. Years later, when David became king and Saul was dead, he would send for Michal, demanding that Ishbosheth, the sole remaining heir to the throne of Saul, hand her over. So David sent messengers to Ishbosheth, Saul's son, saying, "Give me my wife Michal, to whom I was betrothed for 100 foreskins of the Philistine." Ishbosheth sent and took her from her husband, from Paltiel, the son of Laish. But her husband went with her, weeping as he went, and followed her as far as Bahurim. Then Abner said to him, "Go, return." So he returned. 2 Samuel 3, verses 14 through 16. In spite of the fact that David had married multiple wives since his departure from Saul's palace, he had not been able to stop thinking about Michal. He had to have her. So he had her forcibly removed from her husband. And like so many of David's decisions regarding women, this one would prove to be less than ideal. Michal would end up despising David and his God. Their marriage would produce little in the way of love and no offspring. David had a propensity to be driven by desire, and that desire would prove to be a distraction throughout his life. Even in his old age, near the point of death, an attractive woman would play a significant role in his life. King David was now very old, and no matter how many blankets covered him, he could not keep warm. So his advisors told him, "Let us find a young virgin to wait on you and look after you, my lord. She will lie in your arms and keep you warm." So they searched throughout the land of Israel for a beautiful girl, and they found Abishag from Shunem and brought her to the king. The girl was very beautiful, and she looked after the king and took care of him. But the king had no sexual relations with her. 1 Kings 1, verses 1 through 4. We all have weaknesses. Each of us has our spiritual Achilles heel, which Satan, our enemy, knows about and takes full advantage of at every opportunity. He tempts, lures, and entices us. He baits the hook with the very thing we find most attractive. It might be sex, popularity, material possessions, pleasure, a sense of accomplishment, power, or any of a number of things. In essence, our weakness is nothing more than an insight into what we have made an idol in our life. a God that serves as a stand-in or substitute for the one true God. For David, women were his go-to choice for satisfaction, self-worth, and a sense of joy. Sexual pleasure was his idol of choice. What's yours? What do you turn to other than God? What do you worship in place of God? Anything that we allow to rob God of worship is a weakness in our lives that must be confessed and removed. When God said, "You must not have any other God but me," he meant it. And David was going to have to learn to believe it.